I was standing in the church fellowship hall when my stepdaughter corrected the seating chart. Not angrily, not loudly. She smiled and said it would be less confusing if I sat with extended family instead of the front row. Someone nearby called me her dad. She corrected them. My wife didn't. By the end of that same meeting, I'd been removed from the speeches, excluded from family photos, and told, politely, that it would be better if I kept a low profile on the wedding day. And then, as everyone packed up and talked about vendors and timelines, someone handed me paperwork to sign. Utilities, lease extensions, trust disbursements. They didn't want me visible. They just wanted my name to keep working. So I did exactly what they asked. I stepped back, and I took everything that depended on me with me. The meeting was supposed to be routine, just a final walkthrough in the church fellowship hall. Seating charts, timing, who stood where. Folding chairs scraped against the floor. Someone laughed about centerpieces. It felt ordinary enough that I almost missed the moment when I stopped being part of it. My stepdaughter stood near the long table with the layout spread out in front of her. Confident, focused, in control. She moved name cards around with quick, practiced motions. Then she paused at mine. "Oh, actually," she said, smiling, "it might be better if you sit over here." She slid my card from the front row to a section labeled Extended Family. No edge in her voice. No apology, just logistics. "To avoid confusion," she added, like she was doing me a favor. Someone nearby said, "Well, you'll still be close. He's basically her dad anyway." She didn't look up when she corrected them. "He's my mom's husband." The room didn't react. People rarely do when something uncomfortable is said politely. I waited. Not for her, for my wife. She was standing right there, close enough to hear every word. She glanced at the chart, then back at her daughter, and finally at me. She didn't say anything. The meeting kept moving. A few minutes later, the officiant asked about speeches. He read down a list. Mother, biological father, best man, maid of honor. My name wasn't there. "Oh, we decided to keep it simple," my stepdaughter said before anyone could ask. "I don't want people misunderstanding relationships." Again, she smiled. Again, no one challenged it. By the time the photographer's name came up, I already knew the answer. Immediate family photos only. Parents, siblings, not step-parents, not me. I nodded when someone glanced my way like this was all fine, like nothing had shifted. But something had. I'd spent years filling gaps without being seen, covering bills quietly, making sure things ran smoothly behind the scenes. I'd told myself visibility didn't matter as long as the family was steady. Standing there, watching my name get moved again and again, I realized that wasn't true. Visibility mattered when it disappeared. The meeting ended with papers being passed around, vendor confirmations, lease extensions for the apartment the newlyweds would stay in, utility schedules. One of them landed in front of me. "Can you sign this?" someone asked casually. "It just keeps everything active." I looked down at the page. My name was already printed there. They didn't want me erased everywhere, just where people could see. I signed nothing that day. I smiled, folded my hands, and listened. And as the room emptied, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. They had already decided my place. They just hadn't considered what would happen if I accepted it completely. After that meeting, no one checked on me. Not my stepdaughter, not my wife, not a single relative who'd watched my name get moved like a place card that didn't matter. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask for explanations. I went back to doing what I'd always done, handling things quietly. Except this time, I paid attention to how they assumed I would. The first call came 2 days later. A utility company rep asking to confirm continued service for the apartment the newlyweds planned to use after the ceremony. The account was in my name. Had been for years. "Nothing's changing, right?" she asked. I said I needed time to review it. She sounded surprised. That reaction stayed with me. At home, wedding talk continued like nothing had happened. My wife discussed guest counts and catering numbers at the kitchen table, sliding papers around without once looking at me. When I asked who was covering what, she waved it off. "You've always handled the back end," she said. "It's easier that way." Back end. That was the word. Later that evening, I overheard my stepdaughter on the phone. Her voice was light, almost excited. "Once the wedding's over, things will be simpler," she said. "We won't need to manage all the extra dynamics anymore." I didn't hear my name. I didn't need to. A week passed, and more requests came in. A lease renewal to approve. A reminder about the trust account I'd set up years earlier to help with education and emergencies. No one asked if I still wanted to be involved. They assumed. The assumption hurt more than the seating change. I started making a list, not out of anger, but clarity. Every bill in my name, every account tied to my credit, every responsibility I'd absorbed over time without ceremony or acknowledgement. The list was longer than I expected. At night, I sat alone and replayed moments I'd ignored, times I'd been thanked privately but dismissed publicly, included when money was needed, excluded when identity was being defined. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system, and systems don't change unless someone removes the part holding them up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten consequences. I simply stopped confirming assumptions, and that silence, the absence of my automatic yes, was the first thing that made them uneasy. They just didn't know yet what it meant. The first crack showed up as confusion. A vendor emailed asking why a payment hadn't cleared yet. The tone wasn't angry, just puzzled. The system had always worked before. I forwarded the message to my wife without comment. She replied an hour later. "Did you forget to approve this?" Forget. I looked at the word longer than I needed to. I replied that I was reviewing all ongoing commitments and would get back to her. Nothing more. That night, my stepdaughter stopped by the house, not to talk, to check. She moved through the kitchen like everything was normal, opened the fridge, chatted about flower colors and guest lists. Then she glanced at me and said almost casually, "You're still okay handling the utilities and the lease, right? We just need stability through the wedding." Stability. Not help, not support. Stability as if it were a feature I provided. I nodded without committing to anything. That was new. She noticed. Her smile tightened, just a little. The next day, the trust administrator called. A polite reminder that annual disbursements were scheduled and needed confirmation. The trust had been created years ago, my idea, to keep family emergencies from becoming crises. No one had asked if it should continue. I told him to hold. By the end of the week, the tone around me shifted. Questions replaced assumptions. Casual remarks carried an edge. My wife asked if something was wrong at work. My stepdaughter asked if I was stressed. I wasn't. I was calm. That unsettled them more than anger ever could. One evening, I overheard the sentence that made everything click into place. My stepdaughter, speaking to her fiancé, said, "Once everything's finalized, we won't have to depend on him the same way." Depend. Not appreciate. Not include. Depend. That's when I understood what they thought was happening. They believed this was a transition. A cosmetic change where I stepped back publicly but stayed fully engaged behind the scenes. They assumed the structure would hold even if my name disappeared from the front. They were wrong, because the structure only existed as long as I chose to hold it up. And for the first time since I joined this family, I realized something that felt almost like relief. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being relieved of obligation, and once I accepted that, there was nothing left to debate, only paperwork left to file. I didn't make any decisions in a rush. I sat down with the paperwork. Every document I'd signed over the years, every account, lease, and utility tied to my name. The trust agreement I'd drafted with the help of an attorney back when everyone still spoke about family like it meant permanence. I read it all slowly. What struck me wasn't how complicated it was how optional my role had always been. The trust wasn't irrevocable. It required my continued authorization for disbursements. The lease extension had a clean termination window. Utilities could be transferred with a few signatures and 30 days' notice. There was no trap, just assumptions. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for confirmation. I explained the situation calmly, without embellishment. I showed him the seating chart email, the vendor approvals, the trust reminders. He didn't react emotionally. He nodded. "You're not obligated to continue any of this," he said. "You've been choosing to." That sentence stayed with me. Choosing to. For years, I'd framed my involvement as responsibility, as duty, as something I owed because I'd married into this family. But the law didn't see it that way. Neither did the paperwork. I drafted the trust dissolution notice first. Not dramatic, not punitive, just a clean termination of discretionary funding, effective at the end of the month. Then the lease notice. Formal, respectful, plenty of time. Finally, the utilities. Electric, water, internet, insurance, all moved to new ownership or scheduled for transfer. Each document was simple on its own. Together, they dismantled the entire back end. I didn't tell anyone yet, not because I was hiding it, but because the process mattered more than the reaction. These weren't weapons, they were boundaries written in ink. That night, my wife asked if I was okay. I am, I said, and I meant it. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't reacting to someone else's expectations. I was acting on my own clarity. The system they relied on was already coming apart. They just hadn't heard the sound of it yet. The first thing that failed wasn't dramatic. It was small. The internet went out at the apartment. My stepdaughter texted me a screenshot of an error message and asked if I could call it in real quick. That was the phrase she always used, real quick. Like my involvement was a convenience, not a commitment. I replied that the account had been scheduled for transfer and she'd need to contact the provider directly. There was a pause, then a single message. Oh. No anger yet, just surprise. By the end of that week, the lease office called to confirm who would be responsible moving forward. I gave them the new names and forwarded the notice I'd already filed. The woman on the phone thanked me for being proactive. No one else had been. The trust dissolution notice went out next. Certified, documented, quiet, no accusations, no explanations, just an end date. That was when the tone changed. My wife started asking questions that sounded like concern, but felt like inventory checks. Was I still planning to cover certain expenses? Had I already talked to the administrator? Was everything settled? My stepdaughter didn't ask questions at all. She showed up. She stood in the doorway of my office, arms folded, voice tight but controlled. "We need to talk about what you're doing," she said. I looked at her and realized something strange. She wasn't angry about being excluded. She was angry about losing certainty. I told her the truth. Not defensively, not emotionally. "I stepped back," I said. "Like you asked." She stared at me, waiting for the rest. There wasn't any. The wedding plans started to wobble after that. Vendors asked for confirmations that didn't come. Deposits had to be rearranged. Phone calls were returned later than expected. Nothing collapsed all at once. It sagged. And in that sag, everyone could finally see how much weight I'd been carrying without being acknowledged. I didn't explain myself to relatives. I didn't defend my choices. I let the systems speak. Because systems don't argue. They just stop working when the person holding them up walks away. The realization didn't arrive as anger, it arrived as panic. My wife was the first to feel it. She sat across from me at the kitchen table one evening, papers spread out in front of her like they might rearrange themselves if she stared long enough. "The trust administrator called," she said carefully. "They said funding is ending." I nodded. She waited for an explanation, for reassurance, for the version of me that would smooth things over and quietly fix whatever was broken. That version didn't show up. My stepdaughter called later that night. Her voice was tight, controlled, trying very hard not to crack. "You can't just pull everything at once," she said. "This isn't fair." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. "I didn't pull anything," I said. "I stopped providing what I wasn't required to." That's when the mask slipped. She reminded me of how long I'd been around, of how much she'd let me be involved, of everything I'd benefited from by being part of the family. She never mentioned gratitude. She mentioned access. The next few days were a blur of frantic adjustments, last-minute meetings, phone calls made in hallways, people scrambling to take responsibility for things they'd never handled before. I watched it from a distance. Not coldly, just clearly. My wife tried to broker peace. She suggested compromises, temporary extensions. Just until after the wedding. She framed it like a favor I could still do without costing myself much. That's when I finally said the thing that ended the conversation. "I already stepped back." No anger, no accusation, just a boundary, spoken once. After that, the dynamic changed. They stopped assuming, they started asking, and the difference between those two things revealed everything. Because when help is assumed, its absence feels like betrayal. When it's asked for, its denial feels like a choice. I chose not to be part of a system that erased me publicly and relied on me privately. The wedding went forward, altered, tightened, quieter. I attended as requested, from the back. I wore a suit I already owned. I arrived on time. I congratulated them politely. I left early. No scenes, no speeches, no acknowledgments. But as I walked out, a few people stopped me, quietly, privately. They thanked me. Not for money, not for logistics, for how I handled it. And that was the moment I knew something had shifted beyond paperwork. The family didn't collapse because I left. It collapsed because it had been built on silence. And silence only holds until the person carrying it finally speaks, or in my case, finally stops. The weeks after the wedding were quieter than I expected, not peaceful, exposed. When I stepped back, I assumed the consequences would stay private. Missed payments, awkward conversations, tightened budgets behind closed doors. I didn't expect the collapse to spill outward into the open, where everyone could see it. But that's what happens when a system depends on one invisible pillar. Once it's removed, the cracks don't stay hidden. It started with small embarrassments. The apartment lost power again, this time for 2 full days. A neighbor mentioned it casually at the grocery store, asking if everything was okay. Someone else noticed the internet truck parked outside for hours, then leaving without fixing anything. People began asking questions Cassandra couldn't answer cleanly. At a family dinner I didn't attend, someone asked who was handling the lease now. Another asked why the trust had stopped covering certain expenses. The questions weren't accusatory, they were practical. And practical questions are dangerous when you've built your authority on assumption. My wife felt it next. She'd been fielding calls from relatives who were suddenly confused about how things worked. Not angry, confused. The kind of confusion that happens when the story you've been telling no longer matches reality. She tried to defend it at first. "He just wanted space," she told them. "He's still around." It's complicated. But explanations only work when the outcomes don't contradict them, and the outcomes were loud. The wedding gifts were smaller than expected. Bills arrived faster than planned. The new couple downsized their plans almost immediately. Canceled trips, delayed moves, quiet recalculations that everyone noticed. The biological father, who'd been so prominently placed at the ceremony, didn't step in the way people assumed he would. He smiled, he posed, he disappeared. Turns out visibility isn't the same as support. That realization hit Cassandra hard. She showed up at my door one afternoon without calling first. No anger this time, no accusations, just exhaustion. "I didn't think you'd actually stop," she said. "Not I didn't think you were serious. Not I didn't think it would hurt. Just, I didn't think you'd stop." I invited her in, not to reconcile, to be human. She sat on the edge of the chair like she didn't know where she belonged anymore. "You made me look bad," she said quietly. That was the sentence that told me everything. Not you hurt me, not you blindsided us. You made me look bad. I didn't argue. I told her the truth, calmly, the same way I'd been doing for weeks. "I accepted the role you gave me." She didn't respond, because there was nothing to counter. Over the next month, the family adjusted, publicly, not gracefully, not all at once, but visibly. People stopped asking me to fix things. They stopped hinting, stopped circling conversations back to money or logistics. The questions shifted toward Cassandra instead, and she didn't have answers anymore. Her authority faded not through confrontation, but exposure. When people realized how much of her stability had depended on someone she'd chosen to erase, the story rewrote itself without my involvement. That's how reputations really fall. Not with scandal, but with clarity. I didn't celebrate it. I watched it settle. And in that settling, something unexpected happened. People started acknowledging me, quietly, respectfully, in ways that didn't need an audience. A neighbor thanked me for handling things with dignity. A relative told me they finally understood how much I'd been doing. Someone from the community shook my hand and said, "You didn't deserve that." No one said it during the wedding. They said it after, when the truth had time to catch up. That was the real ending of the story. Not the ceremony, not the paperwork, not the silence. It was the moment everyone finally saw what had been holding everything together. and who had chosen to walk away rather than be erased. I didn't take everything with me when I stepped back. That's the part people misunderstand. I gave up the bigger house, the convenience, the comfort of being needed. I downsized to a smaller place on the other side of town. Fewer rooms, fewer responsibilities, fewer expectations attached to my name. Financially, my life got simpler. Smaller accounts, fewer automatic payments, no quiet obligations draining money and energy at the same time. I lived well, not impressively. For the first time in years, every dollar I spent had my consent behind it. And I slept better than I had in a decade. My wife and I didn't survive as a couple. Stepping back made something else clear. We'd been standing on different sides of the same system for a long time. When that system disappeared, so did the version of us that depended on it. The separation was calm, respectful, final, no lawyers, no shouting, just two people acknowledging that clarity had arrived too late to save what wasn't built honestly to begin with. What surprised me most was the community. People I hadn't spoken to in years started stopping me. At the store, at church, on morning walks. Not to gossip, not to pry, to thank me, to say they'd noticed how quietly I'd handled everything, how I hadn't lashed out, how I hadn't embarrassed anyone publicly, how I'd simply stepped back and let the truth do the work. That acknowledgement mattered more than money ever had. I rebuilt my life slowly, intentionally. Mornings became quiet routines instead of interruptions. Evenings became my own. I volunteered. I reconnected with people who knew me without needing anything from me. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself the way power does. It shows up when no one is calling, no one is asking, and nothing is expected. My stepdaughter moved on with her life. So did everyone else. The family didn't fall apart forever. It just reformed without me at the center, and that was exactly how it should have been. I wasn't erased. I was released. And in stepping back the way they asked, I finally stepped into a life that belonged to me. One built on self-respect, earned calm, and the quiet dignity of knowing I didn't need to be seen to matter anymore.